Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford from Son of a Stitch, and this week I'm going to be answering another question from a viewer in the comments of a previous video, and that is how to know what size of needle to use for a project. If you have a question, put it in the comments and I'll see if I can get around to answering it. Also, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you've learned anything from me, and let's get going. Now, when it comes to choosing a needle, there's what's recommended and then there's what is actually going to work best for you. And I'm going to go a little bit over how to decide on both of those counts. Now, the confusing thing about needles is that different kinds of needles have different sizing metrics. So we're going to be talking primarily about tapestry needles, which are the kinds of needles that I recommend using for cross-stitching in almost every circumstance. And that is the general wisdom within the community as well, is that you want a tapestry needle for cross-stitching. The reason we use tapestry needles is because, if you take a look here, they have more of a blunt point. They're not as sharp as, say, an embroidery needle or a sewing needle. Let me see if I can make that better for you. That blunted tip makes it easier to weave your way through the fabric instead of piercing the fabric or your existing stitches. And that allows you to get to line them up nicely so you get a cleaner and neater stitch. Now, the notable exceptions to that I would recommend are if you are doing a bunch of French knots, for instance. I recommend having a sharp needle because you do need to pierce the fabric there. And likewise, if you're doing a lot of fractional stitches, 1/4 or 3/4 stitches on Aida, where you need to pierce the fabric. If you're stitching on linen, though, almost always what you want to be using is a tapestry needle, so you don't pierce through that fabric, which both makes your stitches less consistent and weakens the fabric and increases the likelihood that it'll pull through. Now, for the sizes of fabric that we use most frequently for cross stitch, 14 count Aida or 28 count linen, 16 count Aida or 32 count linen, or 18 count Aida or 36 count linen, it's really handy that the last digit of the stitch count lines up with the last digit of the needle size. So if you're stitching on 14 count Aida, you generally want to use a size 24 tapestry needle. I have a couple of examples of those here. I have some Boan ones, I have some Dritz, and I have a Boan double-sided tapestry needle there. So on 14 count or 28/2, which is effectively 14 count, you want a size 24 needle, so the last digit lines up. Likewise, with 16 count, you want a size 26 needle, and with 18 count, you want a size 28 needle. That is the general received wisdom. Now, personally, I find that most of the time when I'm stitching on 18 count, a 28 count needle is actually too small for me, and I'll talk about how I know that that's happening. But one thing to bear in mind is that between manufacturers of needles, there is a little bit of variation as to how actually big a needle of a particular size is. So if I take these John James and these Peacemakers needles that I have here and compare them with my calipers, if I measure right in the middle of the John James needle, it's about 0.57 millimeters. And if I compare the same position on the size 26 Peacemakers, I got 0.51. I said the names wrong backwards there. So 0.57 for a Peacemaker, 0.51 for a John James. So that's a pretty big difference. It's a 10% variation in how thick those needles actually are. So from manufacturer to manufacturer, the needle shape and thickness and size and length will be just a little bit different. If you look closely, you can also see that these John James ones have a slightly bigger eye than the Peacemakers. Now, of all of them, the Boans have the biggest eye, which is part of why Boan is my favorite brand. But DMC is the brand that Caterpillar ships with their kits, and they'll always send you the right size needle for the kit that you're doing. So you don't have to worry about it if you get one of those kits. And if you join the VIP Stitch Club, you'll also get 10% off the kit. You'll get 8 free PDF cross-stitch patterns in an ebook, and you'll get a digital download of our top 10 cross-stitching tips. So hit the link down there in the description to make sure that you get those great perks. And that way, if you're ordering a kit, you never have to worry about needle selection. Now, there are a few exceptions to the case of just matching up the last digit of the fabric size versus the needle size. One of those exceptions would be if you're working with a specialty thread. If you're using metallic floss or satin floss or like glow in the dark, anything really made from a synthetic fiber, I recommend stepping your needle up one size, because the floss in those cases is not as stretchy and bendy as cotton is, and therefore it's harder to get it through the hole in the fabric. So the slightly larger needle will open the fabric up just a little bit more and put less wear and tear and do less fraying damage to your floss during those stitches. So you want to step your needle up one size in those instances. Sometimes, because of the variations in the process of how fabric is manufactured, the actual sizes of the holes can vary a little bit as well. So how do you tell if this needle that you're using is still the right size? Well, there are a couple of surefire signs that will tell me that I'm using the wrong size needle. One is if I pull my needle up from the back of the fabric while doing a stitch, and I push the needle halfway through, and I go to reach around and grab the needle on the other side, and it falls out of the hole in the fabric, my needle is too small. So in that case, I'll go one size up in needle. So I often do not wind up using 28 count needles because a lot of times they'll fall out. You can also tell your needle is too small if, when pulling your stitches through, you get up to the eye of the needle where the thread is and you go to pull and you get a pop noise as it pulls through the fabric. That means that the needle is not opening the fabric up far enough to get the floss through. Again, that's going to fray your floss, but it's actually also going to make the wear and tear on the fabric and make the holes of the fabric actually bigger, because the needle is slightly tapered. So it gently opens that up and stretches it instead of violently stretching out the fabric as you pull the floss through. So if you're getting a pop noise as you pull your floss through, or if your fingertips hurt from grabbing your needle and pulling it through, you're probably using too small of a needle. Likewise, if your needle is leaving really stretched out holes after each stitch, then your needle is probably too big. But most of the time, washing the fabric actually closes that back up, so it's not as big of a worry using too big of a needle as it is using too small of a needle. But if you're having trouble pushing the needle through, not at the eye, but at the midpoint of the needle or close to the point of it, then your needle is probably too big. And another way that you can tell if you're using too big of a needle is when you try to bury your threads on the back side of the fabric. If you're running the end of your thread under some existing stitches and it's really hard to get through, or it binds up there, or the fabric really fights you when trying to do it, you're probably using too big of a needle. Now, sometimes I like to actually use a different needle for that. I know it's annoying to switch the needle in mid like that, but I will often use actually the next size down when burying my threads on the back, because it just makes it a little bit easier. So that's one of the things that having a nice needle minder is great for, because I can keep a separate size needle on there, and when it's time to bury my thread, I switch out the needle and use the other one. Likewise, if I'm doing French knots, if I'm only doing a couple, I don't use a sharp needle the whole time. I'll keep a pin or a sharp needle on my needle minder and then just pre-poke, pre-drill that fabric hole so that it's a little easier to get my needle through that. Now again, you don't have to worry about that if you're working on linen. That's just specifically on Aida. Now, I love answering questions on the YouTube, and I'm able to answer them a little more thoroughly and with visual representation, which is great. But sometimes it's really great to be able to just consult a community. That's where a thing like the Caterpillar cross-stitch community can be amazing. If you join the Facebook group or follow the Instagram, there are tens of thousands of stitchers in those spaces who can answer questions and give differing viewpoints. And that's where I learned everything that I knew about cross-stitch, was from those kinds of amazing online supportive communities. Well, hopefully with a combination of that rule of thumb and a few things to know to look out for to tell you that you're using the wrong size needle, you should now be armed with the information that you need to choose the correct needle for your project. If you have other advice that you think other viewers might benefit from, or if you have a question for me, leave that in the comments down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next time.